Hello, class. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 15, which is the respiratory system. We're going to discuss the major functions of the respiratory system, list the major organs of the respiratory system, and describe the functions of each. Compare, contrast, and explain the mechanism responsible for the exchange of gases that occurs during external and internal respiration. List and discuss the volumes of air exchange during pulmonary ventilation, and identify and discuss the mechanisms that regulate respiration. So, overview. Basic plan of the respiratory system would be like an inverted tree if it were hollow. The leaves of the tree would be comparable to alveoli, with the microscopic sacs enclosed by networks of capillaries. Passive transport process of diffusion is responsible for the exchange of gases that occurs during respiration. This is where we take in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. And that occurs in the alveoli. So on this, I want you to make sure that you know in yellow, this marks what makes up the upper respiratory tract. This is made of the nasal cavity and the pharynx. In the pharynx, we have the nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and then we have the larynx. Now, the lower respiratory tract is made of the trachea, the left and right primary bronchi, the bronchioles that go down into these alveolar ducts, down into the alveolus sac that contains the alveoli where the gas exchange occurs. So again, the respiratory tract, the upper respiratory tract is the nose, pharynx, and larynx. The lower respiratory tract consists of the trachea, bronchial tree, lungs, and into the alveoli. Now, the respiratory mucosa is a specialized membrane that lines the air distribution tubes in the respiratory tree. You can see the respiratory mucosa in 15.2. More than 125 milliliters of mucus produced each day forms what's called a mucus blanket over much of the respiratory mucosa. This respiratory blanket covers most of the ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelial lining of the air distribution tubes in the respiratory tree. This mucus traps contaminants as they pass through the respiratory tract and act as an extremely important purification mechanism. Usually the mucus and its trapped particles are moved away from the lungs and up towards the pharynx as millions of little hair-like cilia beat in one direction only. This mechanism is called the ciliary or the mucociliary escalator. Now remember, mucus serves as an air purification mechanism by trapping inspired irritants such as dust and pollen. This actually is in our nasal passage as well. So basically, air enters the nose, generally contains a lot of irritants, including chemicals, air pollutants, dust, pollen, bacteria, even insects. And it's a remarkably effective air purification mechanism that removes almost all the contaminants before the air reaches the alveoli in the lungs. If it gets down in there, that cilia helps to beat with the mucus to trap and push it out of our lungs. Again, the cilia on the mucosal cells beat, but they only beat in one direction, which is up towards the pharynx for removal. Now, the upper respiratory tract consists of the nose. We have the nasal septum that separates the interior of the nose into two cavities. You've got a left nair, or nose opening nostril, and a right nair, which is the right nostril. Mucous membrane lines the nose, like I just discussed. Then we have our four paranasal sinuses that we've talked about before. This is the frontal, maxillary, sphenoidal, and ethmoidal sinuses that drain into the nose or into the nasal cavity. The function of the nose is to warm and moisten the inhaled air, and it also contains the sense organs of smell. Again, here's the paranasal sinuses, which consist of the frontal sinus, the maxillary sinus, the sphenoid sinus, and the ethmoid sinus, and they all drain into the nasal cavity. This is what happens when it gets inflamed or infected. It's called sinusitis. It typically develops from colds, which cause inflammation in there. Treatment of sinusitis includes decongestants, analgesics, antibiotics, in some cases surgery to remove the drainage. Then we have the pharynx. This is about 12.5 centimeters or 5 inches long. It is divided into the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The two nasal cavities, the mouth, the esophagus, larynx, and auditory or eustachian tubes all have openings into the pharynx. The pharyngeal tonsils and the openings of the auditory or the eustachian tubes open into the nasopharynx. Tonsils are found in the oropharynx. And mucous membrane lines the pharynx. The function of the pharynx is passageway for foods and liquids. And when we swallow food and liquids, there's an epiglottis that closes off to the lungs so that food goes down the esophagus. When we breathe, the epiglottis is open for air distribution and to pass air down into the trachea, down into the bronchi, further into the lungs. This shows just a side view of everything that is going on in here. Remember, the vocal cords are part of the larynx. So the larynx has several pieces of cartilage that form a framework. The thyroid cartilage, or Adam's apple, is the largest. The epiglottis partially covers the opening into the larynx, and that's what protects the lungs. It closes off and protects the lungs from food and fluid. Then it's mucus lined, and the vocal cords stretch across the interior of the larynx. That's why when you get like laryngitis or inflammation or infection of the larynx, you start to lose your voice. Now, the function of the larynx is air distribution and a passageway for air to move to and from the lungs and voice production. So here you can see where that epiglottis is that closes off. You can see the vocal cords, the thyroid cartilage, or the Adam's apple. We also have what's called the cric cartilage, and it goes further down. So this is a very good image of what the larynx looks like. Now let's move into the lower respiratory tract. It consists of the trachea. This tube is about 11 centimeters or 4.5 inches long that extends from the larynx into the thoracic cavity. It is mucus lined and it has C-shaped rings of cartilage that hold the trachea open. The function of the trachea is passageway for air to move to and from the lungs. If there's an obstruction or blockage of the trachea, that includes the airway, and if blockage is complete, it can cause death in minutes. Tracheal obstruction causes more than 4,000 deaths annually in the United States for various reasons, or from different causes, shall I say. So this shows the trachea. Next, we move in down further into the lung called the bronchial tree. This is where the trachea branches into the right and left bronchi. Each bronchus branches into smaller and smaller tubes, eventually leading to bronchioles. Bronchioles end in clusters of microscopic alveolar sacs, the walls of which are made of alveoli, which again, the function is air distribution. It's a passageway for air to move to and from the alveoli, and the alveoli is where the exchange of gases between air and blood occur. This is oxygen and carbon dioxide. So there's the picture again of the bronchioles and the alveoli. You see the little alveolar duct that house the alveoli on the outside. And if you notice, this little alveolar duct looks like little grape clusters. This shows the alveolus and the respiratory membrane. So a lot of O2, carbon dioxide exchange here. And I want to point out one thing in this image, and that is on the top left, surfactant producing cells. Surfactant is a liquid. If you do not have surfactant, your lungs cannot stay open. So surfactant is required to keep these alveoli open, right? And if the alveoli aren't opened, if they're closed, they can't exchange gas. So surfactant is required to keep the alveoli open. Now let's talk more about the lungs themselves. The lungs are large enough to fill the chest cavity, except for middle space occupied by the heart and large blood vessels. The apex of the lungs is the narrow upper part of each lung under the collarbone. The base of the lungs is the broader part of each lung that rests on the diaphragm. The pleura is the moist, smooth, slippery membrane that lines the chest cavity and covers the outer surface of the lungs. It reduces friction between the lungs and the chest wall during breathing, and if you remember from before, pleurisy is inflammation of the pleura. Function of the lungs is breathing or pulmonary ventilation. So here's the lungs. Now you'll notice on the left lung has two lobes, the left upper lobe and the left lower lobe, because the middle is filled by the heart. So there's only two lobes on the left lung. There's three on the right. You have the right upper lobe, the right middle lobe, and the right lower lobe. This shows a cross where you can see the actual visceral pleura that lines the lungs and the parietal pleura that lines the thoracic cavity there. Now, respiration means exchange of gases between a living organism and its environment. External respiration is known as pulmonary ventilation or breathing, and pulmonary gas exchange. Important to know that. Internal respiration is systemic gas exchange and cellular respiration. So it's happening inside the cells. You can see this here where regulation of breathing comes from the respiratory control centers in the brain, innervates our nerves in there. You can see we've got O2 sensors and CO2 sensors, pH sensors, all in these little capillaries. Again, external respiration is breathing. Internal respiration happens on the internal cell layer of oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange, which occurs again in the alveoli. Now, the mechanics of breathing. Inspiration is movement of air into the lungs. It is an active process where the air moves into the lungs, where we breathe in. And inspiratory muscles include the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. The diaphragm flattens during inspiration and increases the top to bottom length of the thorax. The external intercostals contraction elevates the ribs, increases the size of the thorax from the front to the back and from side to side. Increase in the size of the chest cavity reduces pressure within it, and air will then enter our lungs. So you can see where Inspiration, the lung starts to kind of inflate, flattens out the diaphragm. During expiration, the diaphragm relaxes and the lungs recoil as we breathe out. So expiration, again, as we breathe out, this is the movement of air out of the lungs. Quiet expiration is ordinarily a passive process. We don't have to think about breathing out. During expiration, the thorax returns to its resting size and shape. There is an elastic recoil of lung tissue that aids in expiration. And expiratory muscles used in forceful expiration are the internal intercostals and the abdominal muscles. The internal intercostals contraction depresses the rib cage and decreases the size of the thorax from front to back, and contraction of the abdominal muscles elevates the diaphragm, thus decreasing the size of the thoracic cavity from the top to bottom. Reduction in the size of the thoracic cavity increases its pressure and air leaves the lungs, because it always likes to go from areas of high pressure to lower. So it likes to, at that point, it's coming out, leaving our lungs. Now, pulmonary volumes. So we use something called a spirometer. And after surgery, we use something called an incentive spirometer, which we will talk about in future classes. But a spirometer measures the amount of air exchanged in breathing. Tidal volume is when we take about 500 milliliters of air into our lungs with each normal inspiration and expel it with expiration. That is tidal volume. Vital capacity is the largest amount of air that we can inhale deeply and exhale fully. Expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that can be forcibly exhaled after expiring the tidal volume. And the inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that can be forcefully inspired over and above the normal inspiration. So think about breathe in deep, then breathe in just a little bit more. So the regulation of ventilation. The homeostasis of blood gases. This permits the body to adjust to varying demands for oxygen supply and carbon dioxide removal. The brainstem is in control of our respiration. Most important central regulatory centers in the medulla are called respiratory control centers. These are inspiratory and expiratory centers. Under resting conditions, nervous activity in the respiratory control centers produces a normal rate and depth of respirations. Now here it says 12 to 18 breaths a minute. However, in future classes for nursing, we consider 12 to 20 breaths a minute normal. Now, the cerebral cortex control of respiration. This is voluntary, but it is limited control of the respiratory activity. Then we have something called chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors respond to changes in carbon dioxide, oxygen, and blood acid levels. They are located in the carotid and aortic bodies. So they're in our carotid and our aorta. And then we have pulmonary stretch reflexes. This responds to the stretch in our lungs. So this is a very complicated image. However, I want you to notice on the top left, you can see where it's talking about the brainstem control, right? Emotional responses can be tied in. That's why if you get really anxious, you could hyperventilate, right? Then on the right, you'll see the carotid chemoreceptors and baroreceptors that are coming off in those carotid arteries, and then the aortic chemoreceptors. Breathing patterns. When we say eupnea, EU always means normal. Pnea means breathing. So eupnea is normal breathing. Hyperventilation is when we breathe too fast and too deep. Hypoventilation is slow and shallow. Dyspnea always means abnormal or bad. So this is labored or difficult respirations. Apnea, A is none, right? Without Nia is respiration. So this is where they stopped breathing. There's no breathing. And respiratory arrest is failure to resume breathing after a period of apnea. Now let's talk about the gas exchange and transport. So pulmonary gas exchange. So this is, I know this is complicated, but stay with me. Carbaminohemoglobin breaks down into carbon dioxide and hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide moves out of the lung capillary blood into alveolar air and out of the body in expired air. Oxygen moves from the alveoli into lung capillaries. Hemoglobin combines with the oxygen, producing oxyhemoglobin. So there's your good summary of pulmonary gas exchange. Now, systemic gas exchange is different. Systemic, remember this is throughout the body, oxyhemoglobin breaks down into oxygen and hemoglobin. Oxygen moves out of the tissue capillary blood into tissue cells. Carbon dioxide moves from tissue cells into tissue capillary blood. Hemoglobin then combines with carbon dioxide, forming carbaminohemoglobin. And that starts the pulmonary gas exchange that we just talked about. Now, blood transportation of gases. This is the transport of oxygen and the transport of carbon dioxide. So this shows pulmonary gas exchange and the systemic gas exchange that I just summarized in the two previous slides. Now, I want to note the one thing that's a little different is in systemic gas exchange, we talked about how the carbon dioxide diffuses in the blood. Some of it binds to hemoglobin in the red blood cells to form carbaminohemoglobin. Most carbon dioxide combines with water to then form what's called, which dissociates and ends up as becoming bicarbonate ions. And this is going to be important when we start talking about acid-base balance. But that occurs during systemic gas exchange. And that is the end of the respiratory system. So make sure you go through, read your chapter, pause the video, take your notes, and again, repetition is key. I will be talking to you in the next one.